Tell me if this sounds familiar. You say something, you mean it one way, and the person who hears it takes it completely different. Sound familiar? I see a lot of husbands shaking their heads, yes. Have you done this before? Have you done something, and you meant it in one way, but the person who saw what you did took it completely different? Now, those happen all the time, don't they? They are unintended consequences of our actions. And they're not always bad. Sometimes the unintended consequence is that people take it and they see it as good, and it runs with it, and it becomes something great. And the reality is that no matter what we do, sometimes no matter what our intentions are, that there are consequences to our actions that we cannot always predict. And in John chapter 12 is a great illustration of what it means to have these unintended consequences. Now, John begins this section by giving us a very specific time reference. He says in John 12, verses 1 and 2, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at the table. Now he tells us that Jesus arrives in Bethany, a suburb of Jerusalem, the week of his death. It's interesting, John spends 11 chapters covering 3 years, and then spends 9 chapters covering 6 days. Now, the Passion, the last week of the life of Christ is central to the gospel story. Amen. And he tells us that Jesus has arrived in Bethany. He is about to do the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and he stops here. And they decide to give a dinner in Jesus' honor. And so they are at the table eating this dinner. Now Martha's doing what we would expect her to do, right? She's busy serving. Lazarus is, at the table with Jesus, but we need to understand how they ate their meals. They didn't sit at a table with chairs. Rather, they reclined on the floor on their left arm, where they could reach with their right arm and pick food up off the table. And so people would either be seated directly back from the table or at an angle one from another. And this is important because of what's about to happen here, because Mary takes advantage of this occasion. Verse 3, Mary therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Nard is an oil extracted from a plant that grows in India, and it is said to smell like gladiolus. And it is very expensive to import this from India into Palestine. And so this is a costly thing that she is doing here. And Mary pours this oil on Jesus and uses her hair to wipe his feet. Now there's several things going on. First of all is the costly ointment that's being used, but second is the use of her hair. In the ancient world, women kept their hair up in public. It was considered scandalous for a woman to let her hair down. But Mary, does she care about the norms and the culture of the day? No. In fact, she not only lets her hair down, but she uses it as a towel to wipe the oil, excess oil that has gotten onto Jesus' feet. She, in an extravagant sign of devotion and of love and of appreciation for what Jesus has done, figures that the other people in the house would give her a pass. That they would understand why she's doing this, and that they would see and appreciate her gift that she's giving here to Jesus. But not everyone is on the same wavelength with Mary. We're told, but Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" Judas's role as betrayer will be highlighted by the Gospel of John through the last few chapters here. And it makes you wonder, How could somebody have spent the last 3 years with Jesus, have seen these miracles, have heard his teaching, and not been changed by them? You know, that he's not concerned about any of the things that Jesus is concerned about. Now, this nard was expensive. A denarii was a day's wage, and so if we would make that into the equivalent of minimum wage today, it comes out to about $19,800 is the gift that she is giving here. And Judas pits Mary's generous act against the concern for the poor because it was an issue close at the heart of Jesus. That Judas knew that Jesus was concerned about those who were less fortunate and of our responsibility to help those who are in need. And he's hoping that if he picks on a key issue that Jesus cares about, that a rebuke will come about from Mary. But John pulls back the curtain and reveals Judas's true intentions. He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put in it. You know, he's treasurer of the group, and he's skimming cash for his own personal use. And he sees this as an opportunity to enrich himself a little bit more. You know, if they could get $20,000 all of a sudden put in his bag, well, yeah, he could give a little bit of that to the poor, but then a lot of it could go to him, and he could just enrich himself. Clearly, he's following Jesus for what he can get out of it, not because of what Jesus has to offer him. And so Jesus does come back with a rebuke, just not the one Judas intended. Jesus said, "Leave her alone so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. The poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me." Notice two things. First, he tells them to leave her alone because it's not his job to judge her act of devotion and service to him. He tells her that she can keep it for the day of his burial. She's already poured it out. How can she keep it? Well, the idea is that it's to her credit. She has intended this as an act of selflessness, of an act of devotion, of appreciation for what Jesus has done for her. But in reality, what she's done is pre-anointed him for his upcoming burial. She has done something far beyond she knew and understood. Second, Jesus states that they will always have the poor with them. You know, sometimes we buy into the argument that we can eliminate poverty. But the reality is that there's always going to be poor, aren't there? Let's take, for example, just the idea that the poorest person in the United States makes $50,000 a year. Well, guess what? Isn't everything going to go up because there's more money, and so poor is still poor no matter how much you make? And so Jesus lets us know that there's always going to be people who are going to need our help. But he says, I'm not always going to be around. I'm not always going to be with you. Now, this rebuke that Jesus gives to Judas, we're told in the Gospel of Mark, is the reason that Judas goes and makes a deal with the high priest. Now, if he can't have the money from the nard, he'll go out some other way and make it. And so he does something, Mary does something good, and Judas ends up doing something bad through this act. And all of our actions, whether good or bad, have consequences. Mary's intention was to show her appreciation, but she unintentionally anoints Jesus for burial. She does an act of humility and of service, but she's doing something greater than she was able to do. And we may never know the effects our acts of service will have on others. You know, sometimes we reason, well, you know, it doesn't matter that I don't contribute because all I can put in was a couple of dollars. Do you know what God can do with a couple dollars? Do we know where that eventually will go? Well, you know, I'm not very talented, and so It doesn't matter whether I teach the children's class. Do you know what child you'll teach, what impact they will have on the future, what glory they will bring to God because you used your service? Well, it doesn't really matter whether I come, whether I do, whether I support, and we come up with all these reasons why we shouldn't. But instead, we ought to look at all the reasons why we should and realize that sometimes what God does with the little bit we have actually can go a long way. And therefore, we need to be very careful of critiquing other people's service. Sometimes with the best of intentions, we approach people and we tell them, well, what you ought to do is, and then we fill in the blank, maybe it would be better, and we start telling them how to serve God. Well, did God put you in charge of their talents? Did God give you their resources and tell you to manage them? He didn't, did he? You're responsible for you. They're responsible for them. Because the unintended consequence sometimes when we think through our best efforts that we're trying to help people is they give up serving altogether. Because they get tired of the criticism that comes their way. Judas' intention is to get his hands on more money, and the result is the betrayal of Jesus here. And so we need to allow people to serve the way they can, but we need to monitor our own motives. Because when our motive for doing something is selfishness, especially greed, I guarantee it's going to turn out bad. And we need to be careful that, if there is a need to talk to somebody about something they're doing, that our motive is pure in what we're asking and the way that we're doing it. Amen. That we understand that we should not question other service from a selfish motive because that's dangerous. Clearly, God expects you to serve with the talents and resources He's given you. He didn't put you in charge of somebody else. He didn't tell you to manage what somebody else ought to do. It's not your responsibility to critique how somebody else serves in the kingdom. In fact, we ought to encourage people to serve. We ought to appreciate that we have. That each one of us have different talents and different abilities, and we ought to get creative with the talents and abilities that we have and figure out ways to use them in order to serve God. Because it's what we have. It's what God's given us, and we're going to be held accountable for it. God has put us in charge of what He's given you, and expects for you to use what you have for His glory, trusting Him to use it in ways that you can't even possibly imagine. If you would think back into your own past of the people who have influenced you, of the teachers that you've had, of the people who invested in you. And maybe they thought, well, I'm just teaching a Bible class. That's all I'm doing. I'm just saying hello to somebody. But yet their act of service meant all the difference. And it helped us, and in turn, we're helping others. That there is a way for us to continually continue our service through others that we've invested in. And so I want to encourage you this morning to consider the consequences of your actions. To consider that sometimes God uses what you do in a very small way in a very big way for Him. That you could be the difference between somebody having a life of God or somebody just turning their back on God. That a simple word of hello, that an encouragement could go a long way. And that we live our lives in service to God, realizing that God will use our service in whatever way pleases Him, regardless of what we think it is. And I want to encourage you that if you're not a Christian, you consider the consequences of living a life outside of Christ. That you're living a life outside of what God wants you to be. That you're living in rebellion to Him, and that only by coming in conformity with God will you understand your role and your place in the world. And And that you do that by believing Jesus to be the Christ, repenting of those sins, being immersed in the waters of baptism. But let's remember that as those of us who are Christians, we have acts of service still yet to do. That there's still a job for us to perform. There's not a point for us to retire from God's work. There's not a point where we go, well, I tried that once 20 years ago, and so now I don't have to do it. But that we serve one another. We serve each other. And these acts of service, God can use them any way He pleases. But He can only use them if we're actually busy doing them. So if you need to respond to the invitation, I would encourage you to do that.